Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the legislative branch. So this is part one of my unit on Congress. Congress is a huge chunk, and we're going to look at the basics of Congress in this particular lecture. All right, so what we're going to do today, we're going to identify the basic similarities and differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So this is something that would be in any civics class, basic class. You know, what are some requirements to get into the House? What are some requirements to get into the Senate? We're going to differentiate between the two. We're going to review the organization of Congress. So how is Congress organized among its members? We're going to examine the importance of the incumbency effect. So what exactly is an incumbent, and how does that impact both the House and the Senate? And then kind of as a case study, we're going to explore the 2012 House race in California in the 39th district. Again, I chose this district, this race, simply because I found it very fascinating and something that really relates well to the importance of the incumbency effect and how it relates to the House and how that's different from the Senate. And then we're going to differentiate between the leadership structure in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So in the final part, we're going to look at how is it structured differently in the House and the Senate? What are the similarities and what are the differences there? All right, so let's take a look at the House of Representatives and the Senate. So we have a bicameral legislature. So again, a lot of these things, if you look at the Constitution, actually, the foundations of the Constitution, it really has everything in there. But if you go back to the first couple of lectures, when we talked about the Constitution, it wasn't as in depth about what was said about the House of Representatives and Senators. So in this unit, we're going to hone in specifically on Congress and the legislative branch. But again, the Founding Fathers, they created a bicameral legislature rather than unicameral because not only did they want to divide the powers between the presidency executive, the legislative branch, and the judicial, because they regarded the legislative branch as the primary source of government, and they put that as Article 1. They wanted to divide legislative power between two branches. And so we have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. So these are the two lawmaking bodies in the legislative branch. And again, it's worked for 200 plus years, and there's no other type of government like this in the world in terms of the length it's worked. And again, it served as a model for other countries as well. So in the House of Representatives, you have 435 voting members, which is different than just members. For example, there are non-voting House members in Washington, D.C. And again, I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but one individual in the Electoral College abstained from voting as a way to protest the District of Columbia's lack of representation, voting representation in the House of Representatives. But there are 435 voting members that are apportioned by population. And again, it's reapportioned depending on the census that's taken every 10 years. So if for some reason everyone migrates out of, this is a very ridiculous situation, but let's say everyone save one person migrates out of the great state of California and moves to neighboring Arizona. Well, California, it'd be reapportioned. There'd be one House vote, so that'd be one powerful person, because that person would probably also be the House member representing himself. But based on population, the House reapportions the amount of members that is going to be represented in the Electoral College, so to speak. So you have that, and House members are elected every 2 years. So they're constantly really either running for election or thinking about running for re-election. So the Founding Fathers, they specifically designed a system where the House members, they can't really rest on their laurels. They really have to be out there. They have to be out in front of the public, and they're at a point where they're constantly concerned about re-election. Now, what are some Basic requirements, there are really three only formal requirements for a House member. You gotta be at least 25 years of age, you gotta be a citizen for 7 years, and you gotta live in the state in which the district is located. So those are the three requirements to be a House member: 25, 7 years, and you live in the state. Good way to remember that is, if you can remember the 25 years, well, once you turn 18 years old, then you gotta wait 7 years, because 25 minus 18 equals 7 years. Okay, and you have to live in the state in which your district is located. Now, that being said, let's say you are 26 years old and you lived as a citizen for 10 years, and you live in San Diego. Can you run for a district that's represented in San Francisco, even though you technically live in San Diego? And the answer is yes. So technically you could. It would be really difficult for you to get elected, because an issue that your opponent is likely going to make is that, why is someone from San Diego running for an office in San Francisco? So that would be kind of an informal requirement to live in the district, or at least be very close to the residency. And if you win, then it's generally assumed that you're going to move into the district again. But that's not a constitutional requirement. It just states that you have to live in the state. Okay? And again, there's less prestige. So there's less prestige in the House of Representatives. Now in the Senate, there are a lot fewer members. There's only 100 members, 2 from each state. So is it the case that there are more House members than senators? In most cases, yes. But for example, Wyoming doesn't have a huge population, so they're only allotted 1 House member, and there are 2 senators. So technically, even though the senators represent the entire state as part of the Constitution, just because of the low population, the House member of Wyoming actually represents the entire state as well. So it's not necessarily the case that the senator is going to outnumber, or not necessarily the case that the House members are going to outnumber the senators, but it is possible if you have a very small population. Now, senators only serve 6-year terms, so they only run for election once every 6 years. So it's staggered terms with a third of the Senate elected every 2 years. So if you get elected, it's really kind of a nice situation where, as a senator, you don't have to worry about election for another 6 years. If you get elected again, if you get reelected, that's, over a decade, that's 12 years basically. And if you get reelected that second time, that's nearly 2 decades that you have a job in which, as long as you don't do anything criminal, your job security is pretty much there. So your perspective on governance is going to be a lot different than a House member who's constantly running for election. So when you've only ran for election 3 times, a House member has run for election 9 separate times. So even if that House member continually wins, his mind is constantly on running and being reelected. Whereas a senator, they can vote a little bit more, in peace, without having to worry about how his or her vote is going to affect the upcoming election. Again, this is precisely the way the Founding Fathers designed it. They wanted to have the House of Representatives representing the people, and the Senate representing, more of long-term interests, so to speak. That's not necessarily in line with what the people want. Now, what are the basic requirements? Again, there are 3 formal requirements, just like in the House, but this time you gotta be 30 years old, you gotta be a citizen for 9 years, and you must also live in the state here. So first thing is 30 years old. Second is citizen for 9 years and living in the state. And again, a good way to look at it is, oh yeah, you turn 30 years old, and you subtract 9, and that's, or actually, subtract 9. You subtract 21, which is a landmark age, whereas for 25, you subtract the landmark age of 18 and you get 7 years. And then 30, you subtract the landmark age of turning 21, and you will have had to spend 9 years as citizen, and you must live in the state. Now, in both the House and the Senate, it's not a requirement to have been born in the United States. You just have to have been naturalized you haven't had to be naturalized, or you have been naturalized, but you don't have to be a natural born citizen, which is a requirement for the presidency. So again, as long as you've attained this age. So, someone like myself, I was not born in the United States, but I became a naturalized citizen, which means I'm technically eligible to run for both the House and the Senate just based on the constitutional requirements. But unless there's a constitutional amendment for the presidency, someone such as myself, I was born in South Korea, I'm unable to run for the president. But any other constitutionally elected office, I am capable of running for, but not the presidency because of the natural born requirement, which I consider to be a form of discrimination. But again, that's something the founding fathers have put into place, and if there's something that has to be changed, then a constitutional amendment would change that particular clause in the Constitution. Now, being part of the Senate is also more prestige than in the House of Representatives, simply because, it really is a matter of numbers. There's 100 members in the Senate, and there's 435 in the House. So there's less prestige, simply because there's so many members in the House, where you are in a relatively small club of 100 in the Senate. That being said, if you are in a leadership position in the House, then you relatively may have more power in the House than someone in the Senate. But generally speaking, if you're not either a chairman of the Rules Committee or Ways and Means or Appropriations, generally speaking, you're going to be in a position where if you want to move up in power, you go from the House of Representatives to the Senate. Again, also, if you have aspirations of the presidency, very few House members will make the jump from the House to the presidency or vice presidency. Certainly possible, but generally presidents or VPs come either from the Senate or as governors. So that's generally kind of the rule of thumb. Again, these are informal requirements. Again, the original intent of the Founding Fathers was to have senators originally elected by state legislatures, but that changed in the 17th Amendment when direct election of senators was amended to reflect the way that individuals basically with more education and more wanting to be part of the political process, the Constitution was amended so that it's not the state legislatures, but actually individuals that are directly voting for senators. So the organization of Congress is as such. The two houses meet for 2 years, beginning on the January 3rd of odd-numbered years. So each term is divided into two one-year sessions, so each term. So for example, the 112th Congress, that they met on January 3rd, 2011, and they ended on January 3rd, 2013, per the 20th Amendment, meaning that the 20th Amendment basically changed the dates from March to January. A lot of it had to do with technology. Prior to, the advent of a lot of modern technology, counting the votes, it was a very time-consuming process. So with the elections in November, there's a lot of time given and the travel it would take to go to Washington, D.C. But in today's day and age, the time is not as necessary with instantaneous results and, being able to fly to your location rather than taking a horse. And so as a result, the 20th Amendment basically made it such that it reduced the lame duck period, both for Congress and also the president. So the president, per the 20th Amendment, changes and becomes president on January 20th. Congress, they become the new Congress a little under 2 months, and sometimes exactly 2 months after the election, because the election takes place on the first Tuesday of November. And so on January 3rd, you have a new Congress that reflects the results of the election. Now, the president also, in addition to these sessions, the president may call special sessions in case of national emergency. or for whatever reason. So the president has the ability to call a special session. And again, each state has at least one House member. That's the way everything is structured. So if you have a very low population, then you're guaranteed at least one House member. Whereas you take a look at California and their 50 plus representatives, it reflects the high level of population. Apportionment actually refers to the distribution among the states based on population of the states. Reapportionment refers to the redistribution of congressional seats after the national census is taken every 10 years. So if California loses a huge amount of population, theoretically they can be taken down from its 50 plus House members down to 45 or 44. There'd have to be a huge migration shift. Usually California will either gain or lose one or two seats, and maybe Texas will gain one or two. So it's kind of interesting every 10 years to see how the demographics play out, because it's all relative. So the way the laws are set in Congress right now, there are 435 House seats. So even though population may grow, the number of seats don't grow. It's reapportioned based on population. And each state, they kind of they're given leeway as to how to draw up the lines. And oftentimes it's the state legislatures that draw up the lines. And when they do so by gerrymandering, usually the political party in power for the state. They can use gerrymandering, and that occurs when congressional districts are drawn to favor one political party over another. So the way that congressional districts are drawn up, sometimes they make absolutely no sense from just a standpoint of looking at a map and dividing equal areas. Sometimes the party in power will carve out areas to bombard one area with one political party and make other districts favorable to their political party, so that they get more seats in the House. So that's one of the things that the disadvantages of having the state legislators draw that up. In California, they've actually created a citizen board in which citizens apply to become part of this board where they draw up the districts, and that's how California's districts were drawn up in 2010. So there was redistricting as a result. And so former seats that were occupied by congressmen, some actually just dissolved because of the way that the districts were drawn up. Now, at the same time, now you have special interest groups that are lobbying these citizens for access. So there's going to be pros and cons any way you slice and dice it up. So the incumbency effect. So what is an incumbent? Incumbent is someone who actually holds office right now. So the incumbency effect is the tendency of those already holding office to win re-election. The best way to win an election is have won the previous election. So that's great if you are the incumbent, but if you're a challenger, it's a very difficult task to try to defeat an incumbent. But it happens. But again, it's one of the highest single advantage, because voters they see their congressman, even though they might not favor Congress in general. Congress has sometimes single-digit popularity or approval ratings. At the same time, individuals will love their individual congressman because that congressman has provided Social Security benefits, navigated the bureaucracy and whatnot. And so the incumbency effect is huge. Now, if you actually break it down, the incumbency effect is actually stronger in the House of Representatives than in the Senate. So it might not seem that way. You might think that, being an incumbent in the Senate, you have 6 years, so you're safer. Well, you are safer in the sense that, in the House, you actually have to run, 2 times before, a comparable Senate position is up for election. But that being said, if you're elected in the House, it's much more unlikely that you're going to be ousted by a challenger than in the Senate. So if you're a House member, you run every 2 years, but again, you are very close to your constituents and you are sending out a lot of mailings, again, not through official campaigns, but you're sending letters from your office about your legislative things that you're doing and how you're helping out constituents. So you develop usually a positive relationship with your constituents, and that's why you get reelected. So incumbency effect works to your advantage. One of the things that House members do for the good of your constituents when high school seniors, they apply to West Point, for example, they're required to get a nomination through their congressional office. So chances are the Congress member is going to use that opportunity to help out their constituents, and that indirectly is going to help them in future campaigns. I mean, if your congressperson helped your son or daughter get into West Point, then chances are you're gonna get the vote, even if you cross party lines to do that. Whereas the election in the Senate is more subject to national mood. So if you're a Republican and the national mood is swinging more Democrat, then you could run the best campaign. You can be an incumbent of the state, but you might be voted out simply because you're out of luck, because maybe voters are fed up with Republicans. Same thing with Democrats. If you're a Democrat and the president, let's say, is also a Democrat, and there's a strong backlash against his policies, then you're subject to the whim of the national mood. So the incumbency effect can actually work to your advantage. So there's this idea that you want a clean house, or voters want a clean house. So you could be an incumbent, and that could work against you. Okay. And again, name advantage or name recognition. Challengers tend to be relatively more obscure than the incumbent. For obvious reasons. If you're a politician, then your name is out there all the time, so your name recognition is going to be much higher if you're the incumbent. And again, casework for constituents. You get that Social Security check for your constituent, they're going to vote for you. They just want to have their interests taken after. So people might rail against pork barrel politics or all this pork that's coming in, but if it's pork coming into your home district, then you're going to reward your congressman by voting for him come re-election. So again, office holders have the advantage of helping citizens navigate the bureaucracy. Okay, so a good example, Ron Paul, who is a congressman running for president, a House member, he railed against the establishment. He railed against government excess and government intrusion. But when it came down to casework for his constituents, doggone it, he got his staff to make sure that they were given great customer service and that they were taken care of. So politicians can rail about the national government all they want, but good politics is making sure that the people that vote you into office, that you take care of them. And so incumbents have that inherent advantage of already having provided services for their constituents. Okay, and not only that, they have this unlimited mailing privilege, this franking privilege. And so these members can basically send mail through the U.S. Postal Service without paying. They just use their congressional signatures to send out mail. Challengers can't do that, right? Now, again, for official campaign purposes, you can't send out mail, but you can send out mail to your constituents at the district's expense, showing how you provided or you're a co-author of a bill, and you're keeping your constituents informed of what's going on in Washington, D.C. So incumbents have this huge advantage over their challengers. And what actually, there are other things aside from that, but some of the other things could be you're more visible to constituents, fundraising abilities, experience in campaigning, or voting record. So anytime you get an FRQ question, what are some advantages to being an incumbent? List 3 or 4 advantages. You want to have this in your mind, the idea that, again, you're more visible than your challenger, the ability to raise money, experience in campaigning, and voting record. So visibility, again, although unable to use legislative staff for campaign purposes, it helps that congressmen have presence in their district. Again, fundraising ability, money is huge, right? So you could have the greatest ideas, be the greatest candidate, a photogenic candidate, but you're a challenger and you have no money. And unless you spend your personal money, you kind of have to rely on donations from other people. Now, someone can decide independently to create a super PAC on your behalf and campaign for you, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but as long as you don't coordinate. But not many people are probably going to give or create a PAC and donate $1 million or $2 million to try to get you elected for office. But it is possible, but very rare for something like that to happen. So again, donors like winners. Hence, they will tend to give money to incumbents rather than to challengers, because if you're a big corporation, chances are you want to buy some influence, so to speak. So you don't want to give money to a challenger and so waste your money. So having money helps you win, and when you win, it gets you more money. So it's this kind of a reinforcing effect that fundraising ability has on a candidate's ability to win. Again, experience in campaigning. This seems pretty obvious, but if you win campaigns, winning campaigns beget winning campaigns. You have the right people, and you hire people and you listen to your advice. You've run campaigns before. You're gonna have a natural advantage over a challenger who's probably a relative newbie to the entire process. And again, voting record. Incumbents can run off an actual record, which again mostly works to their advantage. The downside of this obviously is that you have a record, so your challenger can attack your record, but at the same time, you can attack your challenger's lack of experience, that you know what you're doing, and therefore you can help out your constituents, and it can work both ways. So if for some reason that particular election voters are wary of incumbents, then this can actually work to your advantage. But again, for the most part, again, as far as the AP is concerned, incumbency works much better in the House than in the Senate. So case study here that actually again highlights beautifully all the principles of what we've been talking about with this congressional election. There was a 2000 House election between Republican Ed Royce and Democrat Jay Chen. So you had Ed Royce, the Republican, and you had Jay Chen, the Democrat. It's kind of interesting, this particular election, for several reasons why you had an entrenched incumbent and you had a rising political star in the opposing party that had the party support. But not only that, you had newly redrawn districts, because this was the first election after the census. So even though Ed Royce was the incumbent, he was the incumbent only in certain areas, and you had a new redrawn district. So this gave the challenger some level of advantage that normally isn't given to challengers in elections in which the incumbent is already holding office. Because Ed Royce was the incumbent, but he was only a semi-incumbent, so to speak. So there was a chance. But let's go ahead and look at the results and see what happened. So in this newly redistricted 39th District of California, Ed Royce defeated challenger Jay Chen. So Ed Royce was first elected, I believe, in 1998. So this was, something where, he's run several elections. He had campaigned previously before. Sometimes he had some strong challengers, but this was probably his ever since his initial election, this was his strongest challenge. Mostly because of the redistricting created favorable circumstances to the challenger. Okay, so June 5th was the primary, and Ed Royce won 66.3% to Jay Chen's 30%. And there's another individual that got under 3% of the vote. And again, the way California's primaries are set up, there is no Democrat or there is no Republican primary. It's basically, whoever wants to run, and then the top two advance to the general election. So I talked about that in the election structure. And That's basically what happened. Now, what happens, this election was actually kind of interesting because you had a newly drawn district. So there was potentially two Republicans that were going to run in the primary. But basically, kind of probably some, backroom negotiating. But one of the candidates decided not to challenge Ed Royce and run in a neighboring district. But it would have been interesting if you had two Republicans running, and you had one Democrat. Jay Chen was kind of in a similar situation where there was another prominent Democrat that was considering running, but basically kind of bowed out so that there would only be one Republican. So even though there is no Democrat or Republican primary, it's kind of almost fought out, privately, so that there'd be one Republican Democrat. But it's kind of like an exhibition match. The contest doesn't really count. So Ed Royce, he won soundly in the primaries, but the way that the Chen campaign spun it was that Royce, that the election results were misleading because Royce spent tons of money, whereas Jay Chen basically saved a lot of his money for the general election. So was it a victory for Royce? Absolutely. But was there a way that Chen could have seen this as a moral victory? Absolutely as well. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of things that kind of converge on this particular election. Now the November general election, which took place 5 months later, you had the results of Royce winning a pretty sound victory, but definitely less margins than before. So the spending kind of equalized a little bit more. Royce, as the incumbent, though, he had more money that was raised, but he won 57.8% of the vote to Chen's 42.2%. Again, the money was a huge factor. As an incumbent, Royce spent roughly $3 million to Chen's $600,000. Now, again, one of the things that actually came into play was the role of a super PAC. And again, the 2012 election, the existence of super PAC. So even though Chen only had $600,000, there was a super PAC that was created that mostly sent a lot of negative advertisements. So if you lived in that district, you got tons of money being spent by the Royce campaign, by the Chen campaign, by Republican PACs, by a Democrat super PAC, and some were negative and positive. So if you were an independent voter in that district, you were probably bombarded by 3 or 4 pieces of mailing every day. Now, some people might say that, that's just too much, and so there should be restriction. But the counter argument would be that being allowed to just spend however much money kind of equalized things for both candidates. So yes, Royce could send out negative advertisement against Chen, or a super PAC could do the same, but Chen could do the same thing, and so you had negative advertising and positive advertising on both counts. So the information was out there, and basically the voter is left to kind of sort out the truth from kind of the bombardment of all the advertising that was out there. Again, that being said, this was not a typical race, simply because you had a relatively strong challenger facing an incumbent. And again, a lot of the times, especially in California, when the districts are drawn, it's drawn such that the results are pretty much foregone. It's a foregone conclusion. This one, again, the Republican registration advantage was about 7%. So it was clearly considering the registration advantage and the role of incumbency that Ed Royce had. It was pretty much one of those elections where pretty sure you think that Royce, the incumbent, is going to win. But again, Jay Chen put up a strong challenge for this seat in Congress, which isn't always the case with challengers. And in this particular race, because Jay Chen was a relatively strong Democrat candidate, he was able to gain a lot of contributions because he had the potential of winning. So even though Jay Chen didn't win the election, and again, obviously lost, it wasn't an embarrassment at all. It strengthened his resume, and now having run for an election, that adds to his ability to run again. So even though he's not going to be incumbent in the next election, having that experience is going to legitimize him as a future candidate for a seat of office. So, I wouldn't be surprised if he ran at some point again for an open seat in the House. And if he wins, if he were to be an incumbent, it would be a job where, it'd be hard to displace. But again, there's not many jobs out there, so a lot of circumstances have to take place. A lot of things have to converge together. But once they converge for you, then it's very difficult to be unseated. Again, look at Ed Royce's example. His ability to win re-election, even though he was an incumbent. There's just so many factors that favor the incumbent, particularly in the House of Representatives. So again, this incumbency put Royce over the top despite a strong challenge from Chen here. So right here, to give you a better idea, this is Ed Royce. And here's Jay Chen. Now, one of the things that actually made this race pretty interesting was that, as a senior in high school, before Jay Chen actually got involved in more national politics, he actually interned for Ed Royce's office. So that was kind of one of those things that kind of came into play. Now, again, if you look at the district here, so kind of break down kind of the partisan map here. This area right here, was more of LA County. So if you actually look at the LA County results versus Orange County, Jay Chen actually placed very favorably. It was a very 50-50 race in the LA County, but the Orange County tended to be much more Republican. So it was really an advantage that Jay Chen couldn't overcome in Orange County, whereas LA County, he played very favorably and won a lot of the areas in LA. But again, because you had the northern Orange County that again tends to vote Republican, it was a really hard thing for Jay Chen to overcome. So this might have been the case where having the incumbency advantage combined with political party affiliation made it so that winning was just too difficult for the challenger. So if you look at the House of Representatives leadership structure, you have the Speaker of the House. Okay, he's the presiding officer and the most powerful member of the House, and you can argue that he's the most powerful member in both houses of Congress, even the Senate Majority Leader. Again, the Speaker of the House speaks for the entire 435 cohort, so that probably carries more weight than being the Senate Majority Leader. So what do they actually do? Well, if you are the Speaker of the House, you're going to sign bills to committee and control debate. You're going to appoint party members to committees. And again, you're elected by party members, so you are kind of the leader of your political party. Now, if the President of the United States is also the leader of the political party, then you're not the spokesperson for the party. But as the Speaker of the House, you have a vocal. You have a platform that not many other members in the House have. There's also majority leaders. So as majority and minority leaders, the majority leader, they're going to act as, they're going to serve as the Speaker's assistant, and they're going to help plan the legislative program. Now the minority floor leader, they serve as the spokesperson for the minority party. Now again, they might not be the leader of the party as a whole, but as far as the House is concerned, they would be the leader of the minority party. So right here, this picture here is of Nancy Pelosi, and this picture here is of John Boehner. Now what's kind of interesting is that in 2006 from 2010, Nancy Pelosi, she served as the first female Speaker of the House. 2006 was the election in the 6th year of the Bush presidency. Republicans were very unpopular, and so the House was taken over by Democrats. Democrats elected Nancy Pelosi as the first female Speaker. In 2010, which is the 3rd year of Obama's presidency, or actually the end of the 2nd year, Obamacare probably wasn't seen as the most politically popular measure, and that was one of the reasons why Republicans were voted back into the majority, and John Boehner became the Speaker of the House, formerly the Minority Leader, and Nancy Pelosi, who was the Minority Leader, became the Speaker of the House, became the Minority Leader again. So the Majority and Minority Leader in the House, they're not the counterparts. Usually it's the Speaker of the House and Minority Leader. So there is no Speaker of the House really equivalent. There's just the Minority Leader. And again, the Majority Leader is actually second in command in the House of Representatives. And then you have what's called the whip. So whips, they help floor leaders by directing party members in voting and keeping vote counts, and they're pressuring members to vote along party lines. Now, if you ever watch the Netflix series House of Cards, Kevin Spacey, who plays at least in season 1, Frank Underwood, he plays the Democratic Party's whip, and his job is to corral all the votes together. Now, again, I don't necessarily have an insider's view of what actually happens in real Congress, but if anything similar happens in the real Congress as it happens in the House of Cards, then we should probably be a little bit concerned in how our government functions. But House of Cards, if you want to get a good look of the role of the House Majority Whip, then the House of Cards would probably be a good a show to watch. Now again, there's a lot of embellishments and certain things that might not be the most appropriate. But again, there's some episodes that show a great example of how the Majority Whip is counting votes and trying to pressure the members to vote according to party lines. So again, it's a good representation of what the leadership in the House have to go through, and some of the dilemmas that they have if they have members within their party want to break ranks and vote in opposition to what the party wants. Now, the Senate leadership, there's some unique aspects of the Senate leadership as opposed to the House. On the Senate side, the Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate. Okay, the Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is that the Vice President is the only elected official who simultaneously serves in the executive and legislative branch. So the Vice President actually only votes only to break a tie. And actually another thing, ceremonial duty, so to speak, that the Vice President does is that the Vice President will announce the winner of the Electoral College. So what's interesting, in 1988, George H.W. Bush was the Vice President, and he actually was the nominee for the Republicans and won. So he announced himself as being the next president of the United States. Whereas in 2000, it was probably a little bit more bittersweet for Al Gore. He had the privilege of announcing the next president of the United States, and he lost to George W. Bush. So he was in charge of making that announcement. But the role of the Vice President in the Senate, again, if it's a 50-50 tie, then control goes to the party that controls the White House, which actually did exist in the Bush White House for the first couple months until a Vermont senator actually changed from being a Republican to an independent, thereby shifting control of the majority from the Republicans to the Democrats. So what party you officially caucus with actually is going to have an impact on who gets the majority and minority. So the president pro tempore, they're the senior member of the majority party, and they're chosen to preside in the VP's absence. It's a very largely ceremonial role. Now, it is ceremonial, but it is kind of significant. Assuming the president and vice president and the Speaker of the House die, the next in line for the presidency is actually the president pro tempore. So it's something that we as a country, the United States wants to think about. The basically third in line to the presidency after the VP and the Speaker of the House goes to an individual who's probably extremely old and only plays kind of a ceremonial role in controlling the Senate. But the true leader of the Senate is really the Senate Majority Leader. And for the minority party, it's a minority leader. So they act as a party spokesperson for their respective parties. So Harry Reid, a longtime Senate Majority Leader with the Democrat Party in power, and Mitch McConnell as the Senate Minority Leader for the Republicans from Kentucky. And again, they may coordinate with the House, but sometimes, the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans, they're not aligned together, nor are the Senate Democrats and the House Democrats always aligned together in what they want. So the whips, they perform the same function of corralling party members. Probably it's not as effective in the Senate as it is in the House, simply because senators are a little bit more independent than House members are. And again, the big thing is that there's no House equivalent of the Speaker, as individual senators wield relatively more power than their House counterparts. So because it's more of a smaller body, the House of Representatives, or they have a Speaker of the House that controls the entire group. You don't have that equivalent for the Senate. I think the senators would object, because senators, they want to have a little bit more of an individual say of what goes on, rather than deferring to a Speaker of the House equivalent. So let's take a look at some questions here. After a national census has been taken, changes in population distribution. So after national census, changes in population distribution can cause a changing of congressional seats among the states. This effect is called which of the following? So is it congressional districting, apportionment, gerrymandering, reapportionment, or filibustering? Okay. Well, it's not congressional districting. It's not apportionment. That's just the act of, the original act of deciding, how many seats is given. Gerrymandering is drawing up of lines to favor one party over another. Reapportionment is basically what happens every 10 years. So whatever the apportionment was, it's reapportioned based on population. And filibustering is actually a legislative tactic that's unique to the Senate. Okay, example number 2. Which of the following is not true of Congress? Each house determines its own leadership and rules. That is absolutely true. So because it is true, it is not the answer. So let's make sure to cross it out. So I'm going to put a check mark on it, but it's wrong, because it is a correct statement. Terms of Congress last for 2 years. Absolutely. From January 3rd of an odd numbered year to the next odd numbered year. So that is also incorrect. Okay, only the president may call special sessions of Congress. That's absolutely true, so that makes this also incorrect. A session of Congress begins on January 3rd of odd numbered years. Again, that is true, so it is incorrect. So even without looking at answer E, that is the correct answer. So E is Congress is a unicameral institution, and we know it is not unicameral, it is bicameral. Okay, example number 3 here. Which of the following individuals would automatically be disqualified from running for the United States House of Representatives in California? So where would it be the case where individual would not be allowed to run for the House based on the information given here? Let's say you have a random person by the name of Chris Reeder, who's a 32-year-old convicted felon. Is he automatically disqualified? Well, he meets the age requirement. And you know what? There's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits a convicted felon from running for office. Now, can an individual state prohibit convicted felons from running? And the answer is yes, if it's in their state constitution. But there's some states, California being one of them, there actually is a convicted felon that is running for governor. And so it is not something that is constitutionally disqualifying to be a convicted felon. Yeah. Now, let's say a random person named Richard Nares. He's a 57-year-old born in Germany, obviously old enough. Again, the fact he was born in Germany, he could have been a naturalized American citizen. So that in of itself does not disqualify him from running for the House. Adam Penagos, a 26-year-old high school dropout. Now, are there high school dropouts that are in Congress? Not that I'm aware of, but that alone does not disqualify someone from running the House. Any individual that meets the constitutional requirements can file and become a candidate for the House of Representatives. And so again, being a high school dropout, certainly probably not the best resume to have as a politician, but it's not a prerequisite. Okay, David Schmooze, an 80-year-old atheist who owns a small business. 80 years old, probably not the case where an 80-year-old is going to run for office. But again, that's not constitutionally disqualifying. And again, being an atheist is probably not something that is an electable quality, at least not yet. And again, owning a small business has really no bearing on it. So again, by default, the answer is going to be E. Michael Shaw. Michael Shaw, let's assume that Michael Shaw is a 24-year-old who has been a citizen for 6 years and maintains his residence in Arizona. So a couple of things disqualifies him. He's 24 years old, has been a citizen for 6 years, and he lives in Arizona. So these are 3 reasons why he is not eligible constitutionally to run for office in California. Okay, example number 4. Which of the following individuals could run for the United States Senate in the great state of Hawaii? Zachary Taylor. Let's take a look. Can Zachary Taylor, shares the name of our 12th president of the United States, but Zachary Taylor, a 29-year-old native of Hawaii who has spent his entire life on the island of Oahu. All right, that's great, but guess what? Not old enough. So 29, not 30 years old. So based on that, that's the correct answer. You don't have to go even further than that. So as a 29-year-old, you are ineligible to run for the Senate. And so therefore that's the issue. Now, if you're going to be 30 before the election, then there's certain rules and ways around that. But again, if you're not 30 years old, then you're ineligible to become a senator according to the Constitution. Juliet Burke, a 35-year-old doctor who is a resident of Alaska. So actually, again, because he's 29, he cannot run, rather than that being the answer. Juliet Burke, a 35-year-old doctor who is a resident of Alaska, being a resident of Alaska disqualifies. So this is also incorrect. B is also incorrect. Susan Lee, a 32-year-old social worker who immigrated to the United States when she was 25 years old. Okay. Again, that seems like, okay, you're old enough, and you're not necessarily a permanent resident. So she could be a citizen, but the problem is 32 minus 25 equals only 7 years. Let's assume she was granted citizenship when she was 25, which again is actually unlikely, but only 7 years as a citizen means that Susan Lee is also ineligible to be a United States Senator. What about John Park, who is a 40-year-old born in South Korea? Let's say that's all we know about this person. Well, what if he came to the United States much earlier on, could have been naturalized, could have lived in the United States for 9 years? So he could possibly, we don't have enough information, so D is the correct answer. D, E, none of the above is, again, if we found more information about John Park, let's say he never got a citizenship or got it too late or is not a resident of Hawaii, but we don't know that, so E is incorrect as well. So you knock out A, B, C, and E, and D is the correct answer. Okay, and the final example here, example number 5. What position does not exist in the United States Senate? Again, this one should be very simple. There are majority whips, there are minority leaders, there are majority leaders, but there's no Speaker of the House in the Senate. And again, there is a majority whip, there is a minority whip, majority leader, and minority leader. So the answer is E, none of the above, because the Speaker of the House, that position is very unique to the House of Representatives. It's a position, if you want to wield a lot of power, then you can either go to the Senate side of things and be a prominent senator, or you can work your way up in the House of Representatives to the ultimate power position, and that's as the Speaker of the House. Thank you for watching Educator.com.